entre esquina y esquina siempre habrá lo mismo. Para mí no existe cielo, ni luna, ni estrellas. Para mí no alumbra el sol, para mí todo es tiniebla. Ay, 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 que negro es mi destino. Ay, 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 todos de mí se alejan. Ay, 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 perdí toda esperanza. Ay, adiós, solo llegan mis quejas. Te hablo desde aquí y que bufante. Condenado para siempre en esta horrible celda, donde no llega el cariño ni la voz de nadie. Aquí me paso los días y la noche entera, solo vivo del recuerdo eterno de mi madre. Ay, 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 solo espero que llegue. Ay, 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 el día que la muerte, ay, 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 me lleve a estar con ella. Ay, al fin, a cambiar a mi suerte. Vuelve el lamento a los de Villanueva. Y vuelve otra vez.
Ay, que solo estoy, solo me espera la muerte. Ay, que solo estoy, cuando cambiará mi suerte.
Oh, qué triste soledad, vivir en esta condena. Ya no quiero sufrir más, te lo digo Magdalena.
Ay, que solo estoy, solo me espera la muerte. Ay, que solo estoy, cuando cambiará mi suerte.
Compañeros de prisión, gente de toda la clase, que no tienen corazón y no saben lo que hacen.
Solo con mi pena, solo en mi condena. Solo con mi pena, solo en mi condena.
Oye, Fruco, solo voy con mi pena en esta celda. 30 años de condena. May. Sí,
Buenas tardes y bienvenidos. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to Can't Stop Our Blackness, Black Latinx Narratives and Resisting Erasure, featuring by Rosa Clemente. My name is Franklin Ortega Palawachi. I'm excited to be part of these collaborations and we will celebrate together our Latinx Heritage Month, together with all our institutions. I want to give a thanks to Elgin Community College for leading this effort and for putting together this great program with this fantastic speaker. And also want to give kudos to all our college participants, which are McHenry County College, Moraine Valley Community College, Blackhawks College, College of Lake County, Juliet Junior College, Richland Community College, Harper College, College of DuPage, and Bovansi Community College. I will celebrate together Latinx Heritage Month with this important topic in which we highlight our Black Latinx community and the positive impact they have done in Latino America, but also in the United States. Our speaker today will share her story and how we can keep collaborating together for more inclusive society in a Latinx and a Black community in the United States. So it will be a great presentation. We're super excited to have all of you here. So thank you so much for attending to this event. As a couple reminders, we'll be using a Q&A button so you can see a screen. So please write your questions, and we will be getting those questions to our speaker. We are also live streaming this event on YouTube, and that will be for everyone to share, but also it will be recorded. So just to let you know, and thank you again for being here. We are happy to host this event together with LHM Community College. So now I will give the introduction to my colleague, Jessica Moreno.
Thank you, Franklin, and thank you, everybody. My name is Jessica Moreno, and I am about to introduce our wonderful speaker. I will read it in English and do the introduction in English, and Loredana will be introducing her in Spanish. Rosa Alicia Clemente is a Black Puerto Rican woman born and raised in Bronx, New York. She is an organizer, producer, independent journalist, and scholar activist. Rosa was the first ever Afro-Latina woman to run for Vice President of the United States. From Cornell to prisons, Rosa is the leading scholar in the issues of Afro, Black, Latina, Latino, Latinx identity. Her groundbreaking article, Who is Black, published in 2001, was the catalyst for many discussions regarding Blackness and Latinx culture. As an activist with Black Lives Matter, she has continued to address issues of Afro-Black Latinx identity and anti-Blackness through her writings. As an independent journalist, she traveled to Vieques, Puerto Rico, to document the U.S. naval withdrawal from the island after 67 years of U.S. military control. She was in New Orleans and Mississippi as an independent journalist, and merely 10 days after Hurricane Katrina ravaged the area. In 2017, Rosa founded PR Puerto Rico on the Map, an independent, unapologetic Afro-Latinx Center media collective. Recently, Rosa was a producer for the Warner Brothers movie, Judas and the Black Messiah, released this year, 2021, produced by Ryan Coogler, Charles King, and written directly by Chaka King. Rosa is currently completing her PhD at the W.E.B. Du Bois Center at the University of Massachusetts, Elmhurst. Please join me in welcoming Rosa Alicia Clemente.
Buenas tardes. Ahora yo les voy a dar la biografía en español. Rosa Alicia Clemente es una mujer negra puertorriqueña nacida y criada en Bronx, Nueva York. Rosa es organizadora, productora, periodista independiente y activista académica. Ella fue la primera mujer afro-latina en postularse para vicepresidente de los Estados Unidos. Desde Cornell hasta las cárceles, Rosa es una intelectual destacada en temas de identidad afro, negra latina, Latinx. Su artículo pionero, ¿Quién es negro?, publicado en el 2001, fue el fermento de muchas discusiones sobre la negritud en la cultura Latinx. Como activista de Black Lives Matter, ha continuado abordando temas de identidad afro-negro-latinx y antinegritud a través de sus escritos. Como periodista independiente, viajó a Vieques, Puerto Rico, para documentar la retirada naval estadounidense de la isla después de 67 años de control militar estadounidense. Ella estaba en Nueva Orleans y Mississippi como periodista independiente, apenas 10 días después de que el huracán Katrina devastó el área. En el 2017, Rosa fundó PR Puerto Rico on the Map, un colectivo de medios independiente y centrado en afrolatinos. Recientemente, Rosa fue productora de la película de Warner Brothers, Judas and the Black Messiah. Fecha de lanzamiento fue el 1 de febrero del 2021. Producida por Ryan Coogler, Charles King y escrita y dirigida por Chaka King. Rosa actualmente está completando su doctorado en el WIB Budo Center de University de Massachusetts. Unámonos todos para dar la bienvenida a Rosa Alicia Clemente.
I can't, they have to unmute me.
Les damos la bienvenida a Rosa Alicia Clemente. Please join me and welcome Rosa Alicia Clemente.
Okay, I was a little bit on mute, so thank you so much. I just want to first and foremost say thank you to LGen, Gaye, and everybody who worked to put this together, as well as all the community colleges, because I have the list of them. So I appreciate being able to be in space with everybody here. I'm just going to start, and I just need someone who's live to tell me you can all hear and see me before we start, because we don't know what goes on right now with all the social media. Okay, fantastic. So I want to begin my story by reading an article that kind of encapsulates who I am and how I got to who I am as a person and my identity, which is, to me, critically important. In 1993, I was a student at the State University of New York, Albany, when Dr. Maita Moreno Vega came to speak on our campus. Until that evening, I had never heard the term Afro-Latina. In fact, I had just learned what it meant when someone said African descendant. Even though I had grown up in New York City, the Bronx, and Westchester County, Elmsford, respectively and completely embraced and understood that I was Puerto Rican, it was not until I went to college that I began to know who I truly was. The year before, I had joined the Albany State University Black Alliance, ASUBA, and through my involvement with my peers who were racially and politically conscious, I was exposed to the true history of mi gente, my people. This awakening of my racial consciousness would lead me to become an Africana Studies major, and to this day, I have been a scholar activist in the field of Black studies. For me, it became clear that I was an African descendant, so I began to devour anything and everything I could, not only to learn the truth of who I was, but to also confront the lies I had been told by my teachers, family, and TV. Although I began to identify as an African descendant, it was not until I joined the Malcolm X grassroots movement in 2000 that I began to identify as racially Black, and it was not easy for me. In too many movement spaces, and still today, conscious gatherings and panels, I far too often was confronted and accused of selling out as a Latina. Without the mentorship of Dr. Vega and the late Richie Perez, as well as my comrades Lumumba, Monifa, Jabril, Asha, Dream, Raquel, in the Malcolm X grassroots movement and others, I could not have navigated conscious movement and personal spaces that sought to take away my Blackness. I have identified as a Black Puerto Rican woman for 20 years. Although many Latinx people, especially younger ones, are now identifying as Afro-Latinx, I often wonder if it is easier to embrace cultural identifications like food, culture, and hair, as opposed to embracing Pan-Africanism, Blackness, not only as phenotype, but as a political signifier. I cannot tell you how many times in the past few years alone, I have been asked, why are you here? You are not Black. Why are you here? You are a non-Black person of color. So many movement people, leaders, foot soldiers, woke folks fail to understand is that in America, the binary of Black and white has always excluded us and other Black people from the diaspora. One need only look at the media like NBC, ABC, CBS, MSNBC, CNN, Telemundo, Univision, to see that they themselves do not want to portray us in a positive light. Never we as Black Latinx people represented in the media, and you will rarely find Africans from the continent and the Black Caribbean people in dialogues and discussions about race. Despite the growing numbers and the growing racial consciousness of Black Latinx people, much of the prevailing discourse makes the assumption that we must subscribe to the dominant racial paradigm in the United States of America of African American, white American discourse. Too many times we are told by our own people that we have to choose between our racial Black identity or our ethnic one, not just as Puerto Ricans, but as Colombians, Brazilians, Panamanians, Dominicans, Cubans, Ecuadorian, El Salvadorian, Nigerians, Nicaraguans, Mexicano. Going back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Pan-Africanism, the first time an explicit organized identification with Africa and African descendants was happening. With the United States occupation of Cuba and Puerto Rico and the ever-growing migratory presence of both populations in New York and other northeastern cities, the central concern of Black people at that time, wherever they came from, was their relationship specifically to African Americans. But as Puerto Ricans who were made US citizens without our permission, where US citizenship was imposed on us, our greatest connection is the African American community. And people will ask me why. And I'll say, Black people in America and Puerto Ricans have US citizenships, but we are not treated as human or citizens of this country. Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, a Black Puerto Rican who took part in anti-Spanish liberation struggles, was a collector and bibliophile of worldwide Africana experiences. He contributed greatly to the burgeoning field of Black history. Schomburg lived his life on the color line, like W.E.B. Du Bois. His direct knowledge and experience of racism, both in Latin America and the United States, and his alliances with other African-American historians at that time and cultural workers. People forget that this time period is the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance, and that Arturo Alfonso Schomburg's peers were Alan Locke and Marcus Garvey and Anna Garvey and Zora Neale Hurston. At the end of his life, he would identify himself as a Black man. It is incumbent at this moment that we as Afro-Black self-identified people in the United States heed the work of Frantz Fanon, who wrote extensively about decolonizing the mind. It is also necessary that movement organizers, organizations, media firms, and those that fight for racial justice and acknowledge a new generation of Afro-Black Latinx people. As one of my favorite groups, the Welfare Poets, said on their album, Project Blues, who we be, who I be, who we be I, singular I. Now the essence of los Africanos and that of lo Indio run within me. So when you call me Spanish, all my purity seems to vanish because that is not who I be. So don't refer to me with words that blew the trueness to my identity, defining me by a colonizer's language, disregarding my family lineage, my ancestral heritage. I be the rhythm of the conga, played to an internal bomba, extending from Nigeria, from a culture called Yoruba. No one will ever stop my Blackness. It is who I be. My story begins in the South Bronx in 1972. I did not grow up in a movement household. I did not grow up understanding politics and studying history. I had to go to college to even understand that hip hop, the culture of hip hop, was founded in the Bronx by African Americans and mostly Jamaicans and Puerto Ricans. But I did have a great sense of being proud as a Puerto Rican. I never did not have a moment where I had interactions with all my family. Both my parents were very purposeful in making sure that we went to Puerto Rico. We knew who our abuela and abuela was, our primos, our cousins. They were very purposeful in instilling Puerto Rican pride. I was at the Puerto Rican Day Parade, I think it was like 9 months after I was born. But I didn't know anything about the history of my people. I didn't know that we were US citizens, why we were US citizens. I did not know that Puerto Rico was colonized by the United States. I did not know of the freedom fighters like Albizu Campos, the Independentista Party, Lolita Lebron, Harfel, Cansa Miranda, and future Puerto Rican revolutionaries. I didn't know that for decades, these freedom fighters were hunted, attacked, assassinated, incarcerated for fighting for Puerto Rico to be free. I did not know that Johnson & Johnson tested the birth control pill as well as the IUD on mostly Afro-Boricua women. I did not know that 1/3 of the women of Puerto Rico were sterilized between the 1930s and the 1970s. This practice was so common, it was called La Operación. I did not know that the same doctor who led sterilization methods and testing on women without their consent in Puerto Rico would then be sent to Lincoln Hospital. And if you grew up in the Bronx or you know New York City, you know Lincoln Hospital. That same doctor at Lincoln Hospital would then go on to sterilize 5,000 other Latina women and 7,500 African American women without their consent. I had to go to college to find out who I was. I had to take Black studies, Latin American studies, African studies, Puerto Rican studies, feminist studies, to understand why I had not learned anything political or historical about not only Puerto Ricans, but African American, Native American, Asian, and other Afro-Black Latinx people. In my sophomore year, feeling lost, not sure if I wanted to stay in college, I went to a meeting of the Albany State University Black Alliance, ASUBA, one of the first Black student unions ever founded in New York State. And as Drake Grimes, I started from the bottom to get to that top. And that top was beginning to know and understand who I truly was and to confront all the internalizations of white being right, brown stick around, Black get back. I had to truly begin to decolonize my mind. I had to read, I had to study, I had to listen, I had to debate. As a woman, I also had to root out all the internalized patriarchy, as well to begin to deal with the sexual assaults that happened to me. When I was 15, I was raped by an ex-boyfriend. My first year at SUNY Albany, another attempted rape that I got away from. I always thought they were my fault. I thought what happened to me at 5, 15, and 21 was my fault. I had to cleanse my mind, body, and spirit. I had to begin to understand through my Black psychology class, the trauma inflicted on me, but the trauma inflicted on my people. That year, I changed my major from political science to Africana studies. I enrolled in 2 classes, Puerto Rican history and the history of the civil rights movement. I met my first mentor, Professor Colea Clark. I would then meet some of the most amazing Black women professors in my life, some who are still with me. Professor Dr. Vivian Riddell Gordon and Professor Lois Owens. It was then that I transitioned from being another Puerto Rican from the Bronx, and I took leadership classes, became involved in anything and everything. On April 29th, 1992, like the rest of the country, I woke up to see LA rebelling and uprising. I had just been elected to be the president of ASUBA, and the president called all student leaders to a meeting. For those 5 days, all of us as Black and Latino students huddled together to watch, but we also had to understand what was happening. This was the moment I said to myself, I will run for SUBA, and I won. In 1993, the beginning of my junior year and my tenure as president, I sought to bring everyone together. At that time, many of us were still using the word Hispanic. So many of the events that we would do, I would be very, very purposeful in saying, just add Hispanic to it so people feel included and will come. I also have some really dope people around me, and particularly brothers, Echo King, Mark Anthony Williams, Paul Buckley, Jose Albino, and some other sisters like Carmen Polanco, who truly embraced who they were, but also said that I could be part of the organization and run. I became fearless at that time because what I learned fed my soul. Learning about the invasion of our respective homelands like Puerto Rico, Panama, Jamaica, Somalia, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Colombia, Hawaii. It was in college that I read the words of Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Malcolm X. It was in college that I listened to the words of Chuck D and Public Enemy, Diggable Planets, KRS-One, the Welfare Poets, and Dead Prez. But the more I learned, the angrier I got. But that anger led me to my own personal transformation. I was taking a Black psychology class by Dr. Marcia Sutherland. And I came up to her after class and I said, I don't really even want to look at white people right now. That includes white people in my family. And she said, you're going to go through this phase, but you have to move towards the anger and go to your personal transformation. She made me truly understand what it means to be a critical thinker and a writer, but to also be able to debate and challenge white supremacy wherever it is at. I became the president of SUBA and I never looked back. Those 5 years at SUNY Albany, subsequently my 2 years at Cornell University under the guidance of Professor James Turner, are two of the most defining moments in my life. Dr. Turner recruited me and encouraged me to write about the Young Lords Party, but he wanted me to focus on Fred Hampton, the Rainbow Coalition, and the Counterintelligence Program. He wanted me to understand that movements just don't die. There's a fallacy to this day that organizers and movements fail, but they fail to take account of the state and federal governmental apparatus that sought to break and kill our movements. We still to this day have political prisoners and prisoners of war in the walls in the United States who were fighting for Black and Brown people to be free. That Fred Hampton was assassinated, that all the organizations that were left, socialist, anti-imperialist, were taken down by the federal government. If we look just even at the story of Fred Hampton, Chairman Fred Hampton, he was 22 and was deemed such a threat to internal security within the United States, as J. Edgar Hoover named it. He was assassinated with a plan with the FBI and the Chicago police. The reason Fred Hampton became so dangerous was because he created the Rainbow Coalition. He understood that the main problem we were dealing with in America was capitalism, and racism is a byproduct of that. Fred Hampton was 23 years old when he was assassinated. Once Dr. Turner exposed me to all of this, it then exposed me to so many elders and peers. Without SUNY Albany, without Dr. Turner, without Cornell University, without so many peers, without Dr. Gordon, I would have never become an organizer or journalist and a 2008 vice presidential candidate. So I think it is critically important, whatever institution we are in, but particularly higher ed, whether it's community college, a university, or college, that we as Black and Brown students need to understand that these institutions were not made for us. They were not made for us. They did not want us there. They still do not want us there. But through the struggles of the streets, the suites, and college protests all over this country from 1969 to 1974, some of the biggest at UC Berkeley, UMass Amherst, Columbia, and the infamous Cornell University takeover, that we must understand that when we are in these institutions, this bachelor's or master's or even PhD is not for us to disappear from our communities, to walk away. We are the ones that need to be in the communities and also hearing the grassroots, brother, sister, non-binary, queer, trans folks that live in these streets and are fighting every day just to eat and pay rent. These are the grassroots intellectuals. So we cannot be on these campuses talking about, I just want to get my degree and get a job. If you do that, you're betraying what your role is in these institutions. Since 1968, 53 years later, many students of color still have to justify our existence on these campuses. People often say microaggression. I say they are not micro, they're macro, and they're right in our faces. As students of color, we are not allowed to be just students. We also have to be the spokespeople for our communities. One way that I tell Black and Brown students to confront white people on their campus when white folks are like, I don't understand, what am I supposed to do? Ask these white students, can you just go in your dorm room and just study? They will say yes. We will say we cannot. Every day we're walking in these institutions, there's somebody there that's seeking to take it away or believes that we're not supposed to be here. So students of color have to truly understand the system of white supremacy. As Neely Fuller said, until you understand the system of white supremacy, everything and anything will confuse you. If you don't understand systemic oppression, you will always feel like an imposter. You will always feel like what you do is not good enough. You will always question yourself. And once you begin to question who you are, your morals, your politics, your values, your ethics, that's when things begin to fall apart. These institutions to this day remain Eurocentric. I know I'm tired of it, and I'm sure all of you who are students are tired of being a face of a brochure, but a campus that continues to deny access to the very same communities where they reside. So whether we're an undergrad, a graduate student, or someone like me completing their PhD, we have a responsibility to use our scholarship to produce visions from our community. Once we begin to understand that, we will understand what our role is on these campuses. And why is this important? Because we're at a time right now where we are seeing many conversations and discussions around Afro-Black Latinx identity. But the same people having the discussions are erasing us, Afro and Black Latinx people. If you go to Instagram right now and you did a cursory search on organizations that are right now using the term Latinx, then saying we don't want to erase Afro and Black people, by using the term Latinx and not adding Afro and Black, your program has already erased us. I am not one to impose how I feel about my identity on someone else, but I will critique and call out, particularly in mainstream media spaces, on blogs, and in Hollywood, many men and women who are now saying they're Afro-Black Latinx, where last year they were saying, don't call me that. Why? Because everything in this country is a commodity and can be capitalized and commodified. So what we're actually seeing right now is not only the erasure, but the marginalization of Afro-Black Latinx people within Hispanic Heritage Month. And we also need to say that this month does not represent us. Hispanic means descendant of Spain. I am not a descendant of Spain, nor do I want to be one. And we are seeing also high profile, visible, like Latina, Latino, Latinx people talking about like we're 1/3 African, we're 1/3 indigenous, 1/3 white. But what they don't want to say is that the 1/3 Black is the one that's always erased. That's what's denied. That people will always ask me, why do you have to racialize yourself as Black? And I ask them, why do you care? Like, why are you bothered about how I'm raising my daughter, my kids, my family, or how I'm identified? You're bothered because you want to race towards whiteness. And that's what many Latinx people want. They want this system in the government to accept them. They think if they assimilate and don't speak their not only Spanish language, but native indigenous language, that they can get in the room. But what we're seeing now is a complete commodification. And more of us who have been doing the work have to speak out, because we live in a country that is anti-Black. Latino, Latina, Latinx people are not exceptionally anti-Black. And that's also a narrative that we need to stop right now. And I will debate anybody on this. Can we be discriminatory? For sure. Do we play into stereotypes? Absolutely. But we, as quote Latinx people, do not have the institutional or government power to oppress our people. Well, I mean, I guess that could be wrong if we look at who is the head of Homeland Security and ICE is. He's a Latino. Or we can look at the Latino museum that they're building, and they literally have all white Latinos who are on the board, right? So that means that even in this museum that has been sanctioned by the Smithsonian, it is white Latinos making all the exhibits in that, and they're erasing not only Afro-Black Latinx people, but indigenous people. And that this language is a very United States language. Like if you go to Puerto Rico, Brazil, Cuba, if you go around the world, people are not using the term Latinx. They're not saying Afro-Latino, they're not saying Black. They most likely will say indigenous or African descendant. So we have to be real about this. If not, these people are going to write us out of our own narrative and commodify our Blackness. But those of us who identify as Afro-Black Latinx people also have to understand that there is a very specific experience for African-American people in this country and Native Indigenous people in this country. And that history has a specificity to it. That specificity meaning that until African Americans get reparations and Indigenous people in this country get their land back, the American project will continue to fail. And we only need to see what is happening right now in this country to see that the American project is failing. That in a global pandemic, we have the most deaths. That we have two parties of multimillionaires that could care about the rest of us, that we're about to see 50 million people maybe be evicted during a pandemic, that even through this pandemic, we couldn't find a way to get healthcare to be free for everybody or the government, and all of us that are dealing with crushing student debt stuff. But ultimately, I have been talking to young people, and if I could just have a time check real quick, because I don't want to go over. Okay, I think I'm at about 10 minutes left. That young people are really dealing with the climate catastrophe. It is not a climate emergency. Okay, thank you. They said I'm good. It's not just a climate emergency. We are in the midst of a sixth extinction. Everybody just needs to understand science. You know, we have young people that don't know where they move if it's going to be safe. We have young people that have now, for the last 5 or 6 years, have seen wildfires, catastrophes like Hurricane Maria and Irma, wiping off Bahamian islands, island nations in complete catastrophe, floods in New York City. Like, young people do not see a planet that will be inhabitable. Therefore, we have to do a much better job with young people in understanding the existential crisis that they're in. And even with that, and even with a global pandemic, what happened last summer when we all saw George Floyd being murdered live in front of us, so many young people from around the country and the world came out to not only say Black Lives Matter, but to put their bodies on the line. I tell faculty, professors, administrators, educators, that if you do not understand that Black and brown people come into our classrooms already with so much burden of white supremacy, state violence, that our students are coming in and they're seeing and dealing with the trauma of seeing George Floyd killed, Eric Garner suffocated, Sandra Bland on her way to her job killed. When Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans who live in the United States carry that with us. When Black men continue to be executed, when Trayvon Martin killers walk, when Mike Brown is lying for 7 hours in the heat in Ferguson, our students come to the classroom with that. They come to the classroom, and the night before, they just saw children separated, put in cages, ICE and detention raids. They've also seen most politicians lie, and still have power. They understand that in Flint, Michigan, Standing Rock, and so many other places, Newark, that the water is dirty. Right now, I have young people that took my classes when I was at Cal State LA, calling and texting me saying, there's oil on every beach in Southern California because of another pipeline that burst. So they carry that into our classrooms, whether we're together or not at this moment. But then the flip side comes to me and I say, as a historian, what gives me comfort is knowing that our history did not begin with colonization and it did not begin with enslavement. That before capture, enslavement, genocide, that before the ugly tentacles of Western capitalism and imperialism reached us, we have a history that predates all of the systemic oppression inflicted upon Black and brown people all over the world. What gives me comfort is that we are a global people. We are a diasporic people. We are part of transnational collective communities. We create the movements that are needed to dismantle this system. But the only way to do this is to tell the truth about the American project. As I said before, it begins with the kidnapping and enslavement of African people, the forced chattel slavery for over 400 years, the purposeful genocidal killing and extermination of indigenous people and the taking of their land, the exploitation of migrant labor, the land grab for Mexicanos in the Southwest, the denial of equality for women. Think about it. The founding fathers did not even want the women in their lives to be equal. I was going to say Hamilton, and because Hamilton also enslaved or was benefited from the family he married into, the Schuyler family, for enslavement. And I have so many critiques on Hamilton and how that play would not even be made now, because young people would just be like, we're not making a play about somebody that was entitled to people being enslaved. But the fact is that these same white men didn't want their white mother and white grandmother and white wife to have the same rights. So they didn't see us as human. So when we understand this, we also understand that we're not supposed to be here. White supremacy as its own project thought we would be erased. We would not exist. But as Palestinian people have told us that our existence is our resistance, right? And that the only way we fight this is to become organizers. As a professor, when I'm in a classroom, I have no problem telling my students that you are here and I am here to make you an organizer. If you don't want to be an organizer, that's okay. This might not be the class for you. But I am purposeful in the classroom, which probably could account why I am not in the classroom. Because right now, academia talks a really good game of wanting people like us, but then when we get there, they drive us away. So where are we at this current moment? I mean, I think it's hard, right? I know it's hard. We're in a global pandemic. People have lost people. I myself and other people are dealing with people in our family, to our friends, that think that this is all a biological weapon to kill Black and brown people. And I'm like, if it is, it's working, because we're the ones suffering the most. You know, I have a lot of friends that don't want to get vaccinated and have to have hard conversations like, I can't be around, you know, and then I tell them that and they're like, oh, I thought you were more and more politically smart. And I'm like, I believe in science, and yeah, I'm going to get the vaccine, you know. But with all that said, we're not only dealing with that, we're dealing with many people who voted for Biden and Harris. And right now, Trump may run again. Like, that's the actual reality of our electoral political situation, which is also in line with all these states taking away the access to vote. And now Texas and potentially the Supreme Court could overturn Roe versus Wade. So I ask young people, why do you think America's that great? We have the most deaths in a global pandemic. They want to not have us have our own reproductive rights, keep our body to ourselves. We still have the death penalty. We have houseless people in the millions. We have children in poverty. How does that make America more exceptional? You know, and we have a bat crazy white supremacist Republican Party that will eat their own before they admit that anything that the Democrats want to do in terms of money and stuff would benefit a majority of the people. And then we have a lot of young Democrats that thought they were going to go in and shake up the system. Well, you know, it's a difference between you being voted in your district to then you having to work with 535 other members of the Congress and Nancy Pelosi shutting you down every time you want to be progressive. I'm not saying that people shouldn't vote. I vote. I vote for the Green Party. I don't vote for Democrats. You know, I did vote, for Bernie Sanders, but in general, you know, I vote for the Green Party. And I chose to vote for Bernie Sanders because I know it would have been a better presidency than this administration we have now. So I think at this moment, young people need to find an organizing space. Young people need to read, not just on Twitter, not just in posts, but dig deep into reading someone like Frantz Fanon, Ida B. Wells Barnett. Dig deep into reading Lolita LeBron. Look at all the political prisoners. So many of them have, after 30 years, are out, but not all of them are out. But read and Google Jalil Muntaqin, Google David Gilbert, Google Herman Bell. Understand why at 19 and 21, they were captured by the state and lived in prison, were in prison for almost 50 years. And then when they come out, they're back to doing the work. Read about Oscar Lopez Rivera. So when we look at our history, we can't just see it through the lens of oppression. And that we have to understand at the end of the day, and even Fannie Lou Hamer said this, the ballot does not give us freedoms, but it is the power of the people, harness, energize, and organize that will get us free. Our best leaders have never been elected to office. Fannie Lou, Ida B., Harriet, Sojourner, Nat, Lolita, Albizu, Asada, Malcolm, our political prisoners and prisoners of war, Jalil, Mumia, Oscar Lopez Rivera, David Gilbert, Herman Bell, Russell Schultz, Leonard Peltier. These are our leaders. Some of them are free, some are behind the walls. But all of these people never ran for office, but have literally changed the course of history. So as young people in the prime of your life, understanding the climate catastrophe that you're dealing with, at the end of the day, you have to take responsibility for your community. You have to become part of a culture of organizing. It has to be in your DNA. It's in your daily life. We cannot allow white supremacy to break us. We cannot see our work through the white gaze. As women, as trans folks, we have to keep smashing the patriarchy. We have to confront our families and say, some of these traditions are not good. And to all the LGBTQIA, Black and brown, queer young people, thank you. Thank you for teaching us. Thank you for calling out my generation and others. Thank you for taking your space. Thank you for saying it's time for you to be quiet and time to listen. Your queerness is not just an individual thing. You've queered an entire movement. The system of white supremacy seeks to destroy us individually and collectively. So when they say we need more police, we say, no, we want to abolish the police. When they say that only dreamers can get citizenship, we want amnesty for every undocumented people, including every Haitian on the border. When they say free college and canceling student debt is a pie in the sky dream, you say you spent $12 trillion in a 20-year war, where when you chose to withdraw, it was chaotic as anything that we have ever seen. We have to push on the electoral front and tell elected officials that when you vote, your vote is the conscience. When you vote for a budget that increases policing, you are showing your neglect and that you have no conscience, and that our solutions don't come from the ballot box or just voting, but it comes from everything we do. So I'll close out with the words of Kwame Ture, one of also my elders and mentors, and to so many, where he said the job of the conscious is to make the unconscious aware of their own unconsciousness. But that's not the quote I wanted to close out with. I want to close out how I always do with Frederick Douglass, who is just always been my hero. And living in upstate New York, I get to know his life up here and what he did. Not only him and also confronting white women for not having Black women there, for creating the North Star, a Black newspaper. With that said, I do want to say one quick thing. A mantra that I've heard for the last 7 years is, I believe that we will win. And I love it, and I do believe that. And I also know that we'll take many more losses. But as a revolutionary, my faith has never lied in an institution, a building, a grant, a job, my PhD. My faith always lies in the people, the power of the people, culture, art, politics. That all over this country, I know, from rural communities to communities that are incarcerated, people are working every day to end white supremacy. It can be overwhelming, but you have to see yourself in this way. You can do something small every day to stop hyper-masculine, hyper-capitalist society. It can be very small, but you have to commit. What will be your sacrifice? It is not a Snapchat, a TikTok, a hashtag, a t-shirt, a button. It's not something you just wear on a t-shirt. You have to fight for your freedom. If you do not fight for it, it will be taken away. In the words of Frederick Douglass, let me give you a word of the philosophy of reform. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. The conflict has been exciting, agitating, all-absorbing, and for the time being, puts other tumults to silence. It must do this or it does nothing. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, a physical one, and it may be both, but it must be a struggle. Power conceives nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows or both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. Pa'lante siempre pa'lante, and thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to any questions. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosa, for your message and passion in making sure we continue to talk about this very important topic. My own experience in growing up in predominantly white schools during grade school, middle school, high school, our stories were never told in our classrooms. So thank you again for sharing your knowledge so that we can continue to learn and raise our voices. At this time, we will open up the Q&A portion of the program. As a reminder, please use the Q&A function of the Zoom chat function so that we can monitor the questions as they come in. For those on the live stream on YouTube, post your questions in the comments and we'll have staff observing the comments to add questions that you might have. So we do have a few questions already in the Q&A. So from an anonymous attendee, hi, thanks for arranging this event. How can the greater Latinx community be more accepting of people who identify as both African American and Puerto Rican? Growing up, I was seen as not being Latina enough because my name was not Spanish sounding and because I look Black outwardly. How can we challenge this thinking that excludes? Vice versa, how can people stop being surprised that Black people also speak Spanish and can indeed identify as Latinx? Lastly, how can we be kinder to those in the Latinx community that do not speak Spanish? My mom has a Spanish sounding name and is lighter skinned. She gets shunned because she doesn't speak Spanish.
Okay, that was a lot for a question. So, it all speaks to identity at the end of the day. Like, you know, whether you speak Spanish or not is not a harbor of identity. Whether, you know, that definitely isn't, especially when we have generations of younger Afro-Black, Indigenous, Latinx people that have been here, never been to their homeland, only speak English and all of that. You know, I think the larger thing to this is like Afro-Black, identify Latino, Latinx folks that have good politics have to speak out, you know, and that people have to understand, but that some of people who look like us are not here for us. But that we have right now a kind of Hollywood media blogosphere of many white, identified white, passing Latino, Latinx people that purposely are erasing us, and they know who they are. Okay, and the way we affect change is for us to start our own institutions, because they're not going to do it for us. I mean, the reality for me is that in African-American spaces, other African diasporic spaces, Black spaces is where I've always been welcome, is the reason I'm in Black studies and not Latino studies, you know, and all I can say to people like that is that there's a lot of self-hate, you know, colonized lands lead to colonized minds. But after you're 35 and you're still being anti-Black, or you're not calling out the anti-Blackness in your community, then you're part of the problem. But also those of us that identify racially as Black are not going to keep explaining this. Like, we're not going to explain that there's over 18 million of us. I mean, you know, it's hard to explain to people in academia and the nonprofit industrial complex that 2% of our community even has ever heard the term Latinx. I roll with it because I know what it means. It was created for those that are non-gender, gender non-conforming and gender binary. And I appreciate that, you know, but I also say I am not Latinx, right? Because I am I am a heteronormative woman, so for me, I'm like, call me who I am. I'm a Black Puerto Rican. It always seems to offend those that want to erase us. So we have to keep doing the work, and we have to uplift those of us that not just only have the phenotype of Blackness, but have the politic of Blackness and Black freedom.
Thank you. Another question from another participant. If you could give one advice for future generations, what would it be?
Read real books. That's my advice. Books. Read them. All the books. We have, even in we just have too many young people that think everything's a Google search, and I mean, I get asked all the time, where's the scholarship on Black Latinos? I'm like, I have 50 books right here. This is my dissertation part of my thing. Like, it's here, it's been here, not just Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, poets, like everybody, And I know one of the reasons that we are erased is because of us who identify and feel kinship towards Blackness. That just makes us stronger as people of African descent. And white supremacy does not want us to unite. And one of the tenets of white supremacy is to divide and conquer, and I know this personally. I've had to deal with people in my family where I just cut them off at this time. I'm like, I don't really have time for your racism. I'm not here for any of that. And I'm not bringing my daughter around that, because they should know better. But you have to read books. You have to understand theory, methodology. You have to understand scholars that their methodology wasn't working and you're adding something new to that to make it work. But if you're just going on 140 characters and watching TV and whatever, you don't know the vast history of particularly Afro-Black Latinx people here and throughout the world.
To kind of follow up on that, what would be one book or one author that would be a great place to start?
One author, I would say, the Afro-Latino Reader. It's been out for about a decade. Both Professor Roman and Flores, who were partners too, have passed away. But this is a really good introduction. And I would also encourage people to watch Blacks in Latin America. Henry Louis Gates made it about 15 years ago. It's not great, but it does give you, it is 6 episodes on different parts in Latin America, and especially on Dominican Republic and Haiti. So it's a good cursory where to start. And then I would follow, I don't like the word influencers, but there's definitely folks on Instagram like Boricua Chicks, Latino Rebels, Defend Puerto Rico. We have some work from when we did PRonthemap.com, where we did work on Luisa, encouraging people to follow Dr. Marta Moreno Vega on Facebook and see what she has created here in the United States, the Caribbean Cultural Center, but also in Puerto Rico, in Luisa, where there is, that is the community of African descendant people.
Awesome. And then our next question, what do you believe young people who are still not sure, confident in their racial identity should do to embrace this?
Well, what makes someone sure is when they have to deal with it. That's what it's going to come down to, when it personally happens. Too many times people will be like, well, that would never happen to me. And I'm like, yeah, you're not paying attention. It will eventually happen to you. That's how white supremacy exists. But one of the most concrete examples I always tell young folks is, if you're in New York City, you're in Chicago, you're in Austin, you're in Seattle, you're in North Dakota. You're Dominican, your homies Mexicano, and your other homies African American, like Black African American. Right. When the police pull you over, they're not going to ask you what your ethnicity is. Then I'll be like, wait, oh, you're Boricua, you're Chicano. No, you guys could go. We only want the quote Black dude. No, all of you are then a threat. That's how state violence works. And that's why I encourage people, if you haven't watched Judas and the Black Messiah, and not just because I was part of it, you need to understand why Fred Hampton was targeted, because he was bringing together the Brown Berets, the Young Lords, the Black Panther Party, the Weather Underground, the White Patriots, as a Rainbow Coalition, that's when he became dangerous. So particularly as you, as a Latinx person, think that race and ethnicity is not going to be confronted in your own personal space, it will eventually happen. You know, try to be prepared for when it does eventually happen and how you're going to react to that situation.
Thank you. And then another question from Aaron. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. In your experience, how have faith-based communities helped to dismantle or to support and reinforce white supremacy? What role, if any, do you think religious communities should play in resisting injustice and oppression?
Yeah, so I'm an atheist. I was raised a Catholic and I do not participate in anything religious like that. But there are also so many people in my life that have are faith-based, you know, and I encourage people to look up Pastor Michael McBride and other pastors that we talk about them being part of liberation theology, right? So look, for me, wherever we are as a people is a way we can organize, but particularly for the African-American community, understanding that churches were the foundation and sometimes continue to be the foundation of how African-Americans resisted, that there's also like younger people just in general do not have a belief in institutional religion, you know? And there's other ways that you could be connected to your higher power and all of that, you know? I don't practice, but my daughter and my husband practice their religion, you know, and that's fine. We've talked about that. But I know how much it means to grow up in a faith-based community that is not just about the institution itself, but about a way you find community and also a space where people do organize. You know, that cannot be ever discounted at all.
Great. And then Joanna comments and asks, thank you for your presentation. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned that students of color should not simply go to school and get their degree. They would be doing a disservice. Can you expand on this? How can students make an impact without taking on more emotional burdens to educate white folks?
Yeah, so don't take on the emotional burden of educating white folks. That's not your job. Like in organizing, we're like, there's other white folks I can lead you to, and that's not our burden to carry. What I'm saying is that we have a responsibility to not just go to college to get a job, and that in college you will face racism. And the only way to deal with that and to complete your college experience is to connect with organizations on your college campuses. There's a reason BSUs, Latino student unions, were studied, right? Because we were in these predominantly white institutions and we were made to feel and people acted like we weren't supposed to be there, and we had to find community. But I think a larger question now for folks that are in college, undergrads particularly, you have to ask your institution why it's still predominantly white in a country that's becoming predominantly Black and brown. Not Hispanic serving institution or HBCUs like Howard and Spelman and Tuskegee and Jackson State, right? If you're on a predominantly white campus, your job is to ask your chancellor all the way down is like, how is anything predominantly white, period? You know, and confront them on that. And what they'll say is, where can we recruit? And you're like, right down the street. We like in Temple University is in Philadelphia. Right across is a large public housing institution. Why aren't they recruiting there, but they're going 50 miles away to recruit other students? It shows you what these institutions, how they're failing. And through this pandemic, higher education is under a big reckoning right now, because a lot of students are also questioning, like, what's the point? Like, if I can't get a job when I get out of here and I'm in student debt, what's the point? So all of these things are things that you're dealing with, even if you don't think you're dealing with them, and that people are making decisions for you without you at the table.
Samantha writes, in what ways can young people who move on to college or greater things to do to stay grounded or give back to the community? Touching back on your point earlier, in which you stated that we shouldn't just walk away from our communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think community is wherever you live. So wherever you go, there's community organizers, activists there, and it's our responsibility to connect with that, especially if you're in an Ivy League. Someone who went from Cornell, they call it the town and gown, where like the Cornell sits on a hill in Ithaca College and the rest of the community is down the hill, literally. But when I went to get my master's, Dr. Turner told all of us that we weren't just there to get our master's, that we had a responsibility to the Black community that was already there. So colleges and universities seek to detach students from the community around you. But once you start going to community events and supporting, and you being supported by the community and vice versa, your whole perception and how you feel your work and what you can do in this transitionary space, right? Because you're only there for 4 to 6 years, but it'll teach you how to be an organizer, and that's the most important thing.
Great. An anonymous person wrote, because of indoctrination and implicit bias, it can be challenging to overcome self-hate. Can you give us a few tips on how to begin the process of decolonizing your mind?
Yeah, I mean, reading, joining organizations, uplifting culture and arts that speak to us unapologetically, becoming involved in organizations, teaching your kids, the children in your life. I do know that in this world right now, that many of us who have children have done what I call purposeful racial socialization. And what that means is, like, the day my child was born, she was going to be a Black Puerto Rican, and we've always instilled that. And I grew up understanding that, because when I grew up in a part of my life in Westchester County, I did have a good friend that was Jewish, and I learned so much about Judaism, Jewish, like the stories being passed down, and I was like, that's what we need to be doing, like purposely racializing our children. A lot of parents and people in young people's lives will be like, oh, I don't want them to know, I want to shield them. That you're doing a disservice. Okay. We live in a world where police here like handcuff 7-year-old Black girls. So you're like, and detain 8-year-old Latino kids because they had a temper tantrum. So it's like, it's there. So you not being purposely racial socializing yourself, decolonizing, you could end up being a victim of oppression, So it's something you have to do purposely. You have to be unapologetic, and the spaces are out here for that. If we look in the 60s, particularly, that's what we have Black freedom schools. It's why the farm workers movement was teaching young kids, in the summertime, how to become organizers when they were with their parents working the fields. And it's that generation of young people that were able to be like the conduit between their parents, but also the person that wasn't trying to pay your parents. So all that kind of stuff is like, we have to be purposeful, and we can never apologize for it. Like, I think what I see a lot of Black and brown students on predominantly white campuses will be like, I don't want to like offend a white person. I'm like, dude, if you're offending a white person, like, if that's the least that happens, whatever. Like, I find a lot of things offensive every day from whiteness, but it's not your job not to tell the truth because you're going to be offended by a white person in your midst. Like, if that white person is not ready to listen or hear, then you already know how they're rolling, right? But you're also going to be like white folks that are down, that are purposeful, that do give up whatever privilege they have for Black and brown movements and freedom. But ultimately, we are the ones that guide that, So I'm like, yeah. And white people that are down will never be offended by the work that we do.
Very true. Another question coming in. I have hinted at our anti-vaxxers. So when I look at the science, isn't enough for our Black, Indigenous, people of color. Do you have go-to links, articles you use that challenges the MAGA conspiracy theorist rhetoric?
I mean, the CDC is the only reason. I'm like, I got so many people in my family that I'm like, y'all are crazy. I'm like, and then I have people who are like, you're mad political, so you got a vaccine. I'm like, yeah, I did, because I want to live. Like we're in a situation right now where it's not just science, right? Like science is dictating something, but it's also understanding that there is a history in this country of medical experimentation on Black people. I talked about what happened to Puerto Ricans, on the island being sterilized women, right? So I don't discount that. There's an excellent book called Medical Apartheid. But there's also a lot of stuff around the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. There's a movie called No Mas Babies where Latina women in the 80s were being sterilized when they were incarcerated in the California prison system. There's a whole study on Guatemalans in the 80s that were in migrant detention and were given chlamydia or something and see what happened. The same thing with the Tuskegee that I mentioned that gave syphilis to African Americans. So I don't discount that. So if somebody I know is like, yo, but Rosa, come on, like they experimented on this, I'm like, you're absolutely true. More of my I'm not trying to hear you is when first you haven't read the science and then you don't have any examples to talk about that you're being an anti-vaxxer on the my body, my right? But the crazy thing about a lot of people who, let me not just say who don't want to get the vaccine, not just anti-vaxxer, that could be too politically charged. But, I'm like, you drink and smoke every day and you're worried about what you're putting in your body, right? So, or these are the same people that no one should have an abortion. So you don't want the vaccine, but then you also want to control my reproductive right as a woman, right? It's like Republicans love children, but they love the death penalty. You're you respect human life, but not on death row. It's all contradictory. You know what I'm saying? And that's where it's at. At the end of the day, all you could do is make the decision for yourself and the people around you. You can't force anybody to believe or read or be vaccinated. The flip side of it is I also don't want judgment imposed on me and my family and my friends because we are vaccinated.
Thank you. Another question that comes in comment from Maria. Thank you for the great information and sharing your story. What are your biggest takeaways from books like Pedagogy of the Oppressed?
Oh, I mean, Paulo Freire was, what he did with that book and his theory is to say that anybody's capable of learning and that learning is not something that just happens in an institution, and the majority of the world is not in an institution, right? So much learning is tactical. And a lot of the things that are wrong in this country around education is that we're just regurgitating things that were written in a book that don't make any sense for the current, generation. So for me, what he really spoke to was that you decolonize learning. That learning happens when you take a child to pick a tomato and then show them how to grow the tomato. That learning is I don't have to go to get this treatment. I could use aloe vera for my sunburn. And those are very indigenous African things that, get passed down in our communities, right? Vapor rub is a real thing in the Puerto Rican community. In Mexico, yep. And mom was always right, so that idea of not seeing learning in a building or in an institution is the most critical thing, because that means all of us have as some form of access, a way to become critical thinkers and use what's around us to benefit us and us benefit particularly the land that's around us that we are on.
Thank you for that. Everybody has a bottle of Vaporu in their household.
Everybody.
Bridget writes, this has been a great presentation. My question to you is, should those who identify as white participate in these types of conversations, or is it the person of color job to spread literacy to the community?
No, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, that's interesting, but no, if white people want to come down, get some knowledge, you know what I'm saying? What I'm ultimately saying is that we should not be seeing ourselves through whiteness. just like as those of us who identify as women should not be seeing us through the male gaze, which is a very real thing when you look at movies, right? And TV and all of that. You know, so no, like white people want to get down, they want to get down, but they need to get down politically. Like white folks need to basically like reject their whiteness as much as they can. Some of them may be that they're will help organize, will help bring in resources, but a big part of white folks' job is to deal with their family and their community. You know, it goes back to that question of like, do we have the burden? And no, that's an undue burden on us. Like, I have white friends that I'll be like, yo, I can't talk to people right now. Like, I'm gonna send everybody to you because I can't have this conversation about George Floyd. You know, and there's groups that exist out there. One of the best ones I would say is just slipped my mind. Standing Up for Racial Justice, SURJ. They have a lot of chapters around the country, and they're specifically for white people who identify as white, are white, to know what is going on in our communities and what support they can lend and not co-opt or become the face of said movement.
And I think we have time for one more or a couple more questions. The next one, a word that is held to the African-American community, the N-word. Should those who are part of the Afro-Latino, Latina community, should they be allowed to use, should all Hispanics be able to use a word that has been used against African-Americans? What are your thoughts?
No, I mean, I would say no, but I don't use the N-word. So like, that's not like something I do or my daughter or anybody. I'm completely opposed to that, you know, but I also understand young people who've grown up in proximity to each other, especially in major cities, you know, like you cannot go to New York City and hear like mad young people, all types using it, you know. I have a problem with it. I don't use it. And I don't think we should be using it, period.
And then you in your presentation, you mentioned Puerto Rico not being treated as citizens. And we kind of saw that when, as far as like the response to Hurricane Maria. Could you kind of expand on kind of like what the lack of knowledge or like the lack of differences or perception of Puerto Rico and like the United States response to that?
Well, half of Americans don't know that Puerto Ricans are citizens and that we're a colony. So, you know, until we're free and independent, we'll be in a colonial situation. I think one of the things many of us are fighting right now is particularly Democrats and liberals who have found out that if Puerto Ricans on the island could vote in a presidential election, they could actually elect the next president. But they actually don't care about like our freedom. They're just more like, oh, these are American citizens. Because in Puerto Rico, you can't, if you live in Puerto Rico, you cannot vote for the president, even though you have American citizenship. That's why we're like, that's what colonization does, you know. But what's happening in Puerto Rico right now has nothing to do with electoral politics. Post Hurricane Maria and Irma and 45 tossing paper towels, you know, what a lot of young people were just like the consciousness shift, and what you see in Puerto Rico's mutual aid. You know, people realizing, why are we importing 85% of our food into Puerto Rico to pay $7 for an avocado when we grow them here? All of it is tied to colonization. And even, you know, Congresswoman Velasquez and Congresswoman AOC, I think their bill they proposed was super problematic because it, again, talks about studying the condition of Puerto Rico. We don't need to study the condition of Puerto Rico anymore. The situation in Puerto Rico is until we're independent and we could be free, we're a colony. And when we get our freedom, we do not owe $1 to this so-called debt. That this $70 billion in debt is not the burden of Puerto Ricans, that in fact, we should be going to the United Nations when we become independent and can have a seat in the United Nations and saying that reparations has to happen for over 117 years of colonialism of the United States, period. So, I mean, this is a very good example too on identifying as Afro-Black Puerto Rican or Black Puerto Rican woman as I identify. If there's a other Black Puerto Rican man, woman, queer, trans folk that are like, yo, we should be a state. Like, I'm not aligning myself with them just because they're Black. Because just because you have the phenotype of Blackness doesn't mean you're not anti-Black. So for me, this is when politics is very important. Anytime I hear a Boricua talk about statehood or the status that we have now, I'm like, I can't vibe with you politically. If you're not fighting for Puerto Rico to be independent and understanding what's happening on the island right now and understanding that the genocide of women, femicide in our island, but that there's also la feminista colectiva, that there are so many young people in Puerto Rico that are identifying as Afro-Black, trans, queer, but also like in the streets. There was just a march the other day about shutting the government down over continuing to pay any of this debt, you know? So I think post-Hurricane Maria and Irma, a consciousness happened in Puerto Rico where many people may have thought, like, what would we do without the American government? And Hurricane Maria showed the government threw paper towels at us. We're the ones that have been rebuilding. We're the ones that fed people. We're the ones that, you know, covered our own stories and narratives in the media, including Puerto Ricans like me and others that went to the island and were like, we just want to report. That's the other thing with Puerto Rico. We cannot allow as Puerto Ricans on the island and here in the diaspora for anything to pit us against each other because I live in New York and you live in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico en mi corazón, Puerto Rico para la vida. That's what we say. So even if you're Puerto Rican in Chicago, North Dakota, whatever, you have a connection just as much to Puerto Rico, but you also have to be responsible as someone who has privilege in making sure people in Puerto Rico get the resources they need. So eventually our island will be free of United States colonial domination.
Thank you, Rosa, for that. Thank you for your insight and your responses to all of our questions. I know we've been getting a lot of comments in the chat and even in the Q&A that they loved your presentation.
Thank you.
And they were even giving some snap fingers up in there. So,
and everybody, you can find, I'm on Instagram. I'll check afterwards. And I'm just grateful for all the surrounding community colleges that were also part of this event. You know, and I'm glad I would rather be in person, but yeah, it'll happen.
Yeah, the dynamics always change when it's more in person. At this time, I'm going to throw it to Rodolfo, who's going to close us out for our event for today.
Thank you. My name is Rodolfo Ruiz Velasco from College of Clemente. Thank you for attending the event today. I want to thank especially Rosa Clemente. Thank you for your inspiring words. This was 10 community college partnerships. Thank you to Black Hole College, Jana Coach, Loredana Cooper, College of Alicante, myself, College of DuPage, David Swope and Nancy Nieto, Elgin Community College, Gaia Moy and Cristina Garcia, Harper College, Jesus Molina, Juliet Junior College, Michelle Roman Garcia and Veronica Mascote, McHenry Community College, Megan Scanlan, Moraine Valley Community College, Amanda Bedorariz, Richard Community College, Sue Webster, and Wabansi Community College, Franklin Ortega Palaguachi and Jessica Moreno. Please check for follow-up emails. We'll be sending the feedback link and also will be posted in the chat as well. Follow up with resources. Presentation will be emailed to all event attendees who register. And the event recording also will be shared in the YouTube, the Elgin Community College Student Life YouTube. Thank you very much for your attendance, and thank you, Rosa Clemente, again.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Hit me up on Facebook or Instagram, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you.
Buenos días.